So, my name's Clive Gordon Adams. I was born June 29th, 1948 in London, England. My parents were English and Irish on my mom's side and Scotch English on my dad's side. Just to give a little bit of background, I was born in, again, June 29th, 1948, but we moved to the United States. Actually, we moved to Canada in 1950, so I was only 2 years old. And so we emigrated from England to Toronto, Canada, and stayed there for 5 years. And one day I found the family packing up, and we were heading to a place called California, which I knew nothing about in those days. I was about 7 years old. And we drove across the United States. At some point we got on Route 66. I think that was not too far outside Chicago. And it became quite an adventure driving across the United States on that old highway in 1955. And I remember just watching the various landscapes we passed through. I remember driving through, for some reason, I remember driving through Oklahoma, and then everywhere west of Oklahoma seemed very memorable, and especially the deserts and the high deserts in New Mexico. And then after God knows how long we were on the road, maybe 7, 8 days, we arrived in Santa Monica, California, and that was a huge shock. I felt like I had just landed on a different planet when we got to the Pacific Ocean and looked out. And we rented a motel on just above the beach in Santa Monica, and in those days LA was not as crowded by any means as it is now. So we lived in that motel over not too far from Venice Beach. We were kind of between Santa Monica and Venice Beach. And I started acclimating to the California vibe, you might say. I'd never seen anything like it. The way people dressed, the beach lifestyle, it was very, very appealing to me. And so gradually, my dad had a job. He was a packaging engineer, and he went to work for a toy manufacturer named Revell Toy Company that were big in those days. They made HO train sets and all these models of every airplane and ship that ever were in the U.S. military. So I grew up with all those models and all those train sets, and it was kind of like being in paradise, actually, Southern California in those days. And by the time I was 10 years old, in 1958, we were living not too far from the ocean. And it was around that time that I started surfing. And actually, the place where we lived was was Palos Verdes Peninsula, California, which was overlooking the Pacific Ocean and overlooking what was called the South Bay. And it was an incredible place to grow up. And at that time there were open fields everywhere, so I could explore all over the peninsula. And so I grew up surfing for several years, and I was interested mainly in, my hobbies was reading, and I loved to read about real-life adventures, and especially treasure hunting. I was absolutely captivated by stories about treasure hunters, and so for several years that's kind of what my focus was, that and surfing. And I always wanted to grow up to be a treasure hunter, and or an adventurer, or something along those lines, digging up lost cities, those kind of things. That was I was interested in. And I was not interested in religion. I was not interested in God. I was not interested in spirituality, not in those days. And my father was Catholic, my mother was more or less agnostic. And meanwhile, just to give you a picture, we were living in the first subdivision built in Palos Verdes, actually. We were on the very first street of the very first subdivision, overlooking the Palos Verdes golf course and all of LA. So I grew up with an unobstructed view of all of Los Angeles and the lights and the ocean. So it was a fantastic place to grow up. And my mom, she didn't talk about spirituality, my dad, or God. My dad wanted me to go to church, so I started. He was being a Catholic. They tried to indoctrinate me into the Catholic religion. I got confirmed at about the age of 11, or baptized. And I instantly rebelled. I asked the priests a few questions. They couldn't answer any of them. I just said, "That's it. I'm done." And by that time, I was very independent, partly because I was surfing a lot, and the surfing world in those days was very adventurous, and we were always taking surfing trips up and down the coast. And so around 1963, drugs was introduced kind of into our world. I think I probably took LSD in 1963 for the first time, but and it was just a complete mind-boggler. I had a spiritual experience the first time I took LSD, and it was just life-changing. And so I started to research psychedelics, and in those days we had access to peyote, we had access to mescaline, we had access to LSD, and I started turning everyone I knew onto LSD. And I was very effective at doing this, by the way. I just really got into it, and in those days we still were able to get some fairly decent LSD. It wasn't all poisoned or polluted or diluted with other things, which happened later. And then, so taking LSD was kind of my wake up. It was an awakening. I became consciously a seeker, but I wasn't sure what I was seeking. But knowledge was probably the thing that drew me in those days. I was very much into understanding and things, and knowledge was what really intrigued me. I still hadn't thought too much about God, and religion was of no interest at all. So meanwhile, around 1964, 65, now LSD was not illegal in those days. 63, 64, I don't think it became illegal till around 66. So that was the thing I was mainly interested in, was psychedelic. And I knew some pretty famous people that were taking LSD at the time. It was a really big deal. It was spreading all over California. And what happened was in late '66, I got arrested and for distributing LSD, and it was right after LSD became illegal, so it was perfect timing. And at the same time, I was approaching the age where I was 1A. I was like going to be drafted to Vietnam, unless I left the U.S., which I wasn't really thinking of doing. So I got arrested, and it took months to go through the court system, and it was very peculiar, but they wanted to make an example of me because I was a distributor of psychedelics. And so when it came to the time of being sentenced in 1967, I was sentenced to 1 year in jail. I couldn't believe it. I was like shocked. I mean, I was not expecting that. But in retrospect, it was actually a blessing, because if I hadn't been sent to jail, I would have gone to Vietnam. So, and I had no interest in going to Vietnam. So, when I forget when it was in '67. It was probably around October that I was sentenced and went to jail. To make a long story short about this part of it, while in jail, I was sent to a minimum security facility in Ontario, California, and it was, I had my own cell. I had a record player, so I had my whole record collection was there: Bob Dylan, Donovan, the Beatles, Stones, everybody. Joan Baez, all these great albums that I loved. And so it was a fairly cushy place to be, although it wasn't fun. Don't misunderstand me. It was definitely a shock for somebody that had grown up in the bosom of the family, to suddenly be jerked out into an institution with people from completely different backgrounds. It was very, very shocking. I mean, very traumatic. And I spent 3 months before I even got to that facility. I went through the Tracy State Prison, where I saw the hard time people that were in there for murder. I had murderers all around me. So I saw what it was like, and I was happy to get to this minimum security place eventually. And while I was there, I was, you might say, detoxing from having used drugs for about 3 years straight. And I noticed as I got clean from the influence of drugs, that I was able to meditate and get into spontaneous higher states of consciousness without even trying. And it was an interesting lesson, because I was beginning to realize that the drugs may have been necessary at a certain point, but they were not necessary in the long term, because you could achieve states of higher consciousness without them. So that was one of the big takeaways early on when I was in jail. And so I started writing to my parents and asking my mother to bring certain books. So she brought Kahlil Gibran's collection, anything we could get hold of. The Lord of the Rings, I got that whole set. And one book I really wanted, I'm not sure how I knew about it, was Autobiography of a Yogi. I got it somehow. And that book really had an impact in jail, because when you're in jail, you have no distractions at all. If you read something, you practically experience it. And when I read Lord of the Rings in jail, I didn't read the book, I experienced the book. I was living in that world the entire time I was reading it. That's just how it is when you're in it, when there's no distractions. So, around the time I read Autobiography of a Yogi, I started having very unusual experiences. Won't go into, they weren't particularly spiritually significant, but they were, you know, they were definitely, something was going on. I didn't know what it was. One day, it was announced that there would be a series of spiritual and biblical themed films that you could sign up for the whole series, or if you didn't sign up for the whole series, you didn't get to go. It was it was every Tuesday night, and it was on a big screen, and it was obviously being sponsored by some religious organization, and it was for about 10 or 12 weeks, so there's 10 or 12 films, and any excuse to get out of the humdrum of daily institutional life, I was happy to sign up for this thing, even though I had no real interest in Christianity or religion, for that matter. And I had never seen these movies. One of the movies was The Robe, one of the movies was King of Kings, one of the movies was The Ten Commandments, Song of Bernadette. I can't remember all the titles, but when the movie King of Kings night came, I had a very unusual experience. I'm watching the the actor that plays Jesus Christ, his name was Jeffrey Hunter. He had these beautiful blue eyes, and he kind of looked and felt like the Christ. And I was watching the movie, and it came to this part of the movie where Jesus was walking with his disciples over the hills of Galilee, and he seemed to be in a very good mood, and he was sort of encouraging his disciples to ask questions, and it was kind of a free-form back and forth going on, very spontaneous. And suddenly, the whole scene was so familiar, I had a massive deja vu. And they were asking, he was like saying, you know, ask anything you want to ask. And so I forgot I was watching a movie. I completely thought I was in the movie. And it became my turn to ask a question. And the question asked itself through me. It was a thought form. And the question was, why are you always in the past, or everyone's expecting you to come in the future, but you're never here when I'm here? And I just felt this longing. And suddenly, not a split second goes by, and I hear a thought form say, I am here now, and no age is needed me more than this age. I am here now in a human form, and no age is needed me more than this age. And I hear this thought form loud and clear. I mean, just loud and clear. I mean, it's 50 years later right now, and I can still remember it exactly as. And the moment that thought form ended, immediately the movie that I was watching disappeared, and I saw an atom bomb blow up. Like it was as if I was at the Nevada test range during an atom bomb explosion, and I was watching the atom bomb blow up. And then a whole bunch of battle scenes, of war scenes, and movements of troops, and in other words, I was having a vision that was implanted along with that thought form. So the thought form that came from unknown source said, I am here now, and there's no age that is needed me more than, there's no age that is needed me more than this age. Boom, atom bomb, wars, troop movements. I'm seeing all this stuff, and it's like a collage, and it wasn't the movie that I had been watching. I was watching a different movie. I don't even remember the movie past that point, because something happened, and the next thing I remember we were leaving the movie, and I was in this helium state. I was just floating back to the prison and I wasn't in the body. I was just in this helium balloon state, and felt just bliss. And I thought, well, something happened. I don't know what happened, but so for days afterwards, well, my mind was trying to kick in and doubt that this had really happened, nor did it have any real meaning. But every time my mind kicked in and was trying to doubt the thing, that same day, in my cell, because I had a private cell, I would feel a presence come into the cell. And the room, the cell would fill up with divine love, and I could smell, it seems like I could smell roses, and I could smell, well, anyway, it was the same, it was this bliss. And sometimes I would say, well, I knew there was a being there, consciously there. And I would say, who are you? And there was just a dead silence. And no thought forms, no nothing, just a dead silence. And I would go, are you Christ? Are you Buddha? Are you Jesus? Are you God? Are you divine love? I even asked that. Dead silence. And this happened over a period of days. So it happened several times. So what happened was, my mind's tendency to doubt was just overwhelmed by these experiences. I couldn't doubt that something had happened. It was as if I'd had an implant, and I was not the same. And so then what happened was, I noticed that the prisoners in the prison were giving me super wide berth and treating me completely different than before all this happened. So I knew something was going on. People were feeling this energy. In other words, I could feel that I was channeling something, this presence. And boy, did people pick up on it, because in jail, people are very sensitive to each other because there's no distractions. You can just feel it. And then people started actually approaching me and asking me questions, what happened, whatever people would ask, I wouldn't know how to answer, but I would just answer. The information would come. And I don't remember anything specifically about that. I just remember that it happened over and over and over. Then, there's a lot I'm leaving out of this whole experience, this whole thing. I actually threw the first love-in that had ever been held in a prison before. After this experience, I organized this love-in, and it was very successful, although it got a lot of blowback from some groups, because it was a hippie thing, and there was a lot of Hispanics there that were really not into that at all, and but anyway, it was, we did this whole, a love-in, like in LA, there was, love-ins were kind of famous. They probably happened back east at the same time, in the mid-'60s to the late '60s. Anyway, I was released from jail 2 months early, so I got out about September of '68. And I had been out hardly any time at all, and I was in Hermosa Beach, California, walking along the beach, and I spotted this new bookstore that had just opened called the Awakener Bookstore. And I walked up to the door, and there was a big poster on the door, said, and I looked at the face, and I was shocked. It looked like Jesus Christ, exactly. I mean, and it said, I was Rama, I was Krishna, I was this one, I was that one, and now I am Meher Baba. And as soon as I read that and looked at the face, the picture, I heard a voice in my head go, you're either who you say you are or you are a complete phony, but you're nothing in between. So I knew I had to investigate this because he looked exactly like Christ, and the words, I knew what the words meant because it somehow connected to my experience in jail. Meaning I was expecting that I wasn't consciously expecting it, but subconsciously I was expecting some kind of confirmation about that experience that I had in jail, that I had heard this voice say, I am here now, meaning the Christ. So here was the confirmation, so I had to check it out. I walked into the bookstore. Initially I had a very odd experience. I could not, every time I'd look at a book title, the ink would disappear. It was like disappearing ink. Everywhere I looked in the bookstore, same thing happened. I couldn't read a single book title because they would disappear as I'm looking at them. And suddenly I look over on this little table and there was a pamphlet floating off the table in Technicolor. I could read it. It said, God in a Pill, ? And I knew I had to buy it. I put a quarter down on the table. I was so embarrassed by, or kind of freaked by this experience, that I just grabbed the pamphlet and ran out of the bookstore and read it immediately. And I realized that this guy wanted me to read that pamphlet before anything else. And I 100% agreed with everything in the pamphlet. I realized that whoever Mayor Baba was, he knew the drug situation almost perfectly. I mean, I couldn't argue with anything because while I was in jail, I had come to the same realizations. So reading this was almost like reading something your higher self had written. And I thought, well, this is intriguing, but then somehow for some days or weeks, I didn't get back to the bookstore. And so what happened was I was staying with this yogi lady, an older lady, very unusual lady, very similar to Agnes Barron type. She was like a yogi, you know, from way back, and white hair, and she drove giant Cadillacs. She was a machinist at Hughes Aircraft. I mean, totally unusual lady. I was staying at her house, and she was a follower of Yogananda. She wasn't interested in Mayor Baba. But I was already sort of distantly thinking, I got to check Mayor Baba out some more. I wasn't convinced about the whole thing. And I hadn't been living with this lady for very long when, I think her name was Rachel, there was a knock at the door, and this guy I knew from surfing days named Jimmy Irons was there at the door, and he said, could you and your friends come out? He knew me from surfing. He said, come on, could you come out? A guy's car is broken down in front of your house, and we need to push it, give him a push start. So we went out there in the street, pushed this guy's car. The guy that was driving the car didn't speak English, and he was from India, which is very strange in our residential neighborhood in those days to see a guy from India that didn't speak English. And anyway, we got him push started, and Jimmy came back to the house, and he tried to get his motorcycle going, and it wouldn't start. And he said, I guess Baba wants me to be here. And he came in the house, and it was around 4 in the afternoon. He talked about Mayor Baba till 11 o'clock at night. So, and he wouldn't have stopped even then, except around 11 o'clock, we heard a crash in front of the house. And I had just been thinking, if he says another word, I'm going to drown. Meaning there was so much love in the room, we were drowning. And right at that moment, around 11 o'clock, we hear this crash in front of our house, and across the street. But it was very unusual at that time of night to hear anything. It was a very quiet residential street. And I had the same experience. We floated across the street in this helium state, and we find ourselves looking up at a fire hydrant with the water shooting up 40 feet in the air. And and that was kind of the end of, that was my coming to Baba, was looking up at that fire hydrant of water shooting up in the air. Somebody had just hit the fire hydrant, and you know, their car was up on the curb and damaged. But that was when I realized, okay, Mayor Baba's, something's really going on with him. So I made it a mental note to the next day I was going to that bookstore, and I was going to buy them. All the books that are important, because I needed to understand if this was for real. So that's what I did. The next day I bought God Speaks, Discourses, and Avatar. I read Avatar first, was very impressed by that book. And I'm very, very glad I read Avatar first. It kind of brought everything to life. There was something about it that was like a spiritual classic. And then I read the Discourse. I think I read Discourses, or I may have read God Speaks next. And I kind of locked myself in a closet to do it, because it was so hard to read. And I powered right through the book. And that was an experience. And then I did the Discourses. Meanwhile, I found out there were Baba meetings in Santa Monica. There were also sort of informal Baba meetings at the Awakener bookstore in Hermosa Beach. And Jack Small was involved with that bookstore, as was a couple of other people that were all friends of Phyllis Frederick. So I ended up meeting Phyllis Frederick, because she lived in Hermosa Beach in those days. And the first meeting with Phyllis, I don't remember the exact meeting, but meeting her was like fantastic. I mean, she was the real deal. She was channeling Baba like nobody that I had ever met. And so her meetings were fantastic. But when I went to the Venice Beach bookstore, Baba bookstore, which was open in those days, I found out about the Darshan, the 1969 upcoming Darshan. This is around October 68. And so I immediately thought about it, and I thought, well, I gotta meet Mayor Baba. I mean, that's sort of the coup de grace. The only way I'm gonna be able to be 100% convinced that he's the avatar of Christ is I gotta meet him. So that leads into the second story, which is the 1969 Darshan. So I went to the Venice bookstore. I met a lot of Baba lovers that I'd never met. That was where I first remember meeting Jack Small and Virginia Small, his mother, and a whole bunch of people. And suddenly I find out that everyone's going to this Darshan in India that Baba had invited new and old lovers to go. So I thought about it, instantly signed up. I have to go. And I was actually one of the late ones, meaning most people already had their tickets, they already had their shots. So I was right at, this is almost into November, I think. And this was around the time I was also reading God Speaks and Discourses. And just from reading those books, intellectually I was convinced that Baba was the avatar, but there was some part of me that was not I wasn't 100% there yet. But just the divine logic of the discourses, his teachings, and was, I mean, it was unlike anything I'd ever read, and it was just unbelievably compelling. But the idea of going to Darshan was really exciting, to meet Meher Baba. Now, because I was such a latecomer, and other people had known about Baba for a lot longer, I had not really, I couldn't quite grasp the concept that he was in a physical body. It was still all a spiritual experience. Like I hadn't yet, I began to identify with him as a physical form so much. It was an inner experience. It had been happening since jail. And so when on January 31st, now I already had my tickets, I was definitely going. I got in a big fight with my father about the fact that I was spending all this money to go to India. And so I got almost no family support for this venture. But I knew I had to go, and suddenly January 31st comes around, and we were at a beautiful estate that overlooked the Pacific Ocean on the cliffs. It was Commander Struebel's house. It was a giant Spanish villa, and it had been taken over by Baba lovers. It was a whole bunch of Baba people who were living there. Jimmy Irons and the woman I ended up marrying, Terry, was there, and anyway, it was a whole bunch of people, and it was we were having a wonderful time, and suddenly we find out we happened to be all in a group meditation overlooking the ocean, and in walks Jack Small with a suit on and reads the telegram from India, and that Meher Baba has dropped the body. Now, pretty much everybody was freaking out because they'd known about Baba longer than I had. I was not freaking out because I hadn't fully grasped the concept that he was actually in a body. It was hard, it was intellectual. I just hadn't. So I was sort of unaffected when I heard the news. I thought, I sort of knew that I was going to go to India anyway, instantly, whereas everybody else was pretty much flipping out one way or another. And this led to at least one whole plane load of pilgrims canceling their trip. So a lot of people changed their mind about going to India. Within a few days after Baba dropping the body, we heard from his disciples in India that they were going to honor his wish and proceed as if he was there, because he had said he would be there to meet his lovers new and old. So they had already come back, but yet people were canceling like crazy. So because of that, the chaos that followed Baba's dropping the body, I ended up getting shifted. I was going to be flying out of California. I ended up having to figure out a way to get to New York to go with the society. Or the New York group, actually. It was New York and the society. So I had to, suddenly I'm like, with a few other people, we had to figure out how to get to New York. And actually it was very interesting that this happened because it led to a number of adventures that I would never have had this all not gone down the way it went down. And so basically what happened was, in order to meet my flight, which was leaving New York in late April, or was it, no, could have been May, I think it was May. It was the Darshan began April 10th and ended on June 10th. So what is that, that should be 2 months. Is that 2 months? Yeah. So it was a 60-day window. We were on I got diverted to the third flight, the final U.S. contingent of, which was leaving from New York. So what I did was I found a drive-away car that you could drive from Los Angeles to New York. You didn't have to pay for the car because you're delivering it to some family in New York. And in fact, they even paid for gas to get the car there. So it was a really good situation. And it ended up 5 of us went in that car from LA. Actually 3 from LA, and then we picked up 2, a husband and wife, from a little village in New Mexico near Santa Fe. A guy named Robert Van Arsdale and his wife. And Robert Van Arsdale was a Harvard graduate in the same class with Alan Cohen. I think Alan graduated from Harvard, didn't he? Pretty sure. Anyway, he was friends with Alan Cohen, and he was friends with Robert Dreyfus. So I'd never heard of Robert Van Arsdale. Anyway, we picked him and his wife up, but before when we picked him up, we actually ended up spending a few days in New Mexico. And something happened. I fell in love with New Mexico. I mean, I ended up moving there in 1972, I think. So for some reason, I was destined to go to New Mexico, and had a number of incredible experiences while we were in New Mexico. Went and visited the Lama commune up in a place called Lama that Robert Dreyfus had once lived there and worked on the community. And Robert Van Arsdale had been the designer for part of the community that they built, so he took us up there. We had a great time. Anyway, we drove across the United States. We got to New York, and again, we had another series of adventures. We had 7 days to kill in New York. So I'd never been to New York City. It was just like being in an Alice in Wonderland storybook for me. It was just such an unusual, major city. And what we did, which was, I don't know whose idea it was we went to every spiritual center we could find in New York City. We went to the Rudolf Steiner Center, we went to the Vedanta Center, we went to the, I don't know if SRF had a center, but we went to the Edgar Cayce Center. They had a center there, and I met Edgar Cayce's son, Hugh Lane Cayce. Everywhere we went, we were telling people about Maribava. And so every spiritual center we went to, they found out all about Maribava, because, and that was, so I had some strange connection with Rudolf Steiner, with Cayce, with Vedanta, with Ramakrishna. All of that sort of came out of those visits to those centers. And I forget all the places we went. But anyway, we went to a number of places that Baba had gone also when he was in New York City. And then we also went to one of the society meetings and met Harry Kenmore and the group society. And then we left, one day we went to the airport and got on an Air India flight to India. And before we got on the flight, I could feel this energy come into the airplane. Or in fact, I felt it in the airport before we got in the plane. It was like a force field just took over the plane. That was the first time I realized, wow, this isn't just a normal trip to India. Meaning I felt this presence take charge of the plane from the moment we got in it. And so, I forget, our flight ended up landing a couple places, and one of them was Beirut, Lebanon. I don't know why. And then we found ourselves in Bombay in the middle of the night. And Darshan was, I think, 8 days. It was a very short, relatively short trip, considering it was halfway around the world. But I remember the first experience I had was when we got off the plane in Bombay, which it was called in those days, not Mumbai. The smell of India hit me like a ton of bricks. That was the first thing. The second thing was, because in those days you just had those things that roll up to the plane and you walk down, and then you walk across the asphalt. When I stepped on the asphalt, I immediately said, I'm home. I could feel my heart center go, I'm home, and I started weeping. I mean, it was totally spontaneous. I still could get teary-eyed just from, I don't know what, I was not expecting that, and it was almost counterintuitive because the smell was so assaulting. It was so horrible in a certain way that you don't expect to have a spiritual experience stepping onto the asphalt of the Bombay airport. But I just felt my heart go, I'm home. And it was a deep, deep experience, whatever that was. Then we took the train to Pune. We were met at the airport by maybe 100 or 200 Baba lovers. It was a huge group that met us. I brought a camera with me, so I took pictures for the whole 8 days. I had my dad's Leica, and I have those slides still. In fact, they're going to be hopefully fully transferred, digitized this year, and for the 50th reunion of the Darshan. And so there was a number of things that happened. There was a lot of tension because people were very tired going on buses and then the train. And so there was a lot of fighting. I could see the New York group was fighting with the society. It was interesting to see that because I'd never, it was almost a fist fight between John Bass and somebody else, one of the society guys. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And so when we got to Pune, I found out that Phyllis Frederick had arranged for some of us to stay at the Pune Club, which was an old British, it was during the British Raj, it was a place, a watering hole and for the British, I don't know if it was aristocracy, but it was certainly it was like really nice old colonial vibe about it. And now I didn't know how lucky we were until I saw the other hotels where everyone else was staying, which were just kind of crummy hotel. I mean, they weren't bad, but the Pune Club was where Dr. Duncan was staying there. Adi would come over there. Phyllis was there. So it was a really, really nice place to stay. And so my first memory after getting to the Pune Club and spending one day there was the first meal we had at the Pune Club was Dr. Duncan was sitting with us. And the food was so hot that nobody could eat it. And either Duncan or somebody else said, well, this is actually mild. Most of us in those days were not used to Indian food. I mean, I didn't grow up with any kind of exposure to that type of food, and it was really hard to eat it at first. Anyway, but and they said, well, it'll get a little hotter every day. This is just the starting temperature of the food. People are just going, whoa. Anyway, so the first time we showed up, there was, I think, 4 days at Guru Prasad that were part of what Baba had, the events were arranged. So it was 4 straight days. So on the first day, this was probably the high point of the whole experience for me. First day we get to Guru Prasad, we're walking, getting off the buses. There's 150 of us at least, maybe 200, I don't remember. It was somewhere 150 to 200, and not everybody had been on our plane. Some people came overland, some people were on other flights. So, but it was all Westerners from Europe. There wasn't too many from Europe, but there were some. England especially. As we arrived, this was where I got my shock, because I had not really, the reality of the whole thing did not hit me until this moment. As I'm walking up the steps of Guru Prasad, I looked at the Mandali who were arrayed along the railings, and I was like shocked. I recognized every one of them. I mean, literally as if I knew them. And this was the biggest shock of the whole darshan for me. In other words, I suddenly realized, oh my God, I know these people, and they know me. Now, what is that about? Now, I was like 20 years, I'm trying to think of, I was 21, and this is something I had not been expecting. And they looked more like, they were so familiar that they were more familiar than my own relatives. That's how familiar they were. And so that was my, I realized I had really come home. These really were my family. And so, and all the rest of the darshan did was confirm that. And I've got some photographs, but I don't have them on my computer, but of the darshan. And, just sitting with the Mandali and talking with Mani and talking with Mara. I met Mara privately with, Phyllis brought me in there to meet Jimmy Irons and I to meet her privately. And she gave us these little gifts. And I could tell she was suffering terribly, Mara. And I somehow I understood why she was suffering, but not exactly, but I could see that she was the most in pain. The other ones had a really brave face. So I met Rano, I met Adi, Sarosh, Mani, Duncan, Padre. I mean, everybody was there. I don't know how many Mandali, but there was somewhere between 20 and 40 Mandali. Baal would have been there. I met Bao, who was very different in those days. He was very, not front and center. He was very almost invisible in a certain way. And Erich, of course. Erich was like, Erich and Mani, just, they were so familiar. And anyway, the first day of the darshan, you could feel that Mayor Baba was there. There was no doubt about it. It was just, and Erich was he said, all this has been recorded so people they know this, but he He said, "You've all kept your appointment with God." And the way he said it, and the way the big chime clock had just gone off with these significant chimes, and Eric suddenly says, "You've all kept your appointment with God." I got to say that's how it began. It was like electric, totally electric, though, and it was 4 days of electricity. And personally, I didn't see how you could possibly have been at the Darshan and have been the same person afterwards. It was just there was no doubt in my mind from that experience, even though Baba wasn't there in the physical. Any doubts I had prior to going were completely erased. Partly through that experience of realizing how I had connections with his disciples. In other words, it was like one big giant cosmic deja vu. And where it all comes from, I don't have a clue, but obviously from past other advents. It was all familiar. And so there was a few other little anecdotes that were really cool. For instance, I was there when, I think it was Jim Irons or might have been Tim Owens, who was my brother-in-law for a while, Timmy Owens, asked Dr. Duncan, one of them asked Dr. Duncan, "Well, you had a really great career going as a doctor in England. You could have, why did you give all that up to live in India?" Something like that. And Duncan, there was a long pause, and Duncan, in those days, his eyes were very set, deeply set in his head. You could, he was almost as if he was looking inward all the time. And there was a long pause, and then he said, the love was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. And he goes like that. And you could actually see him cutting he said there was nowhere else to go. And it was the most eccentric answer to a question I'd ever heard. And then there was one other interesting anecdote with Duncan, and that was that on the day we had to leave in Pune, we had just bought out the entire music store in Pune. We had wiped the shelves clean. There was nothing left. The guy every instrument of it purchased, essentially. We bought every sitar, we bought every harmonium, I bought, I think, a harmonium. Anyway, so people were looking for a way to carry these things onto the plane. And so we brought the problem because people had sitars, they had all the stuff. And how are we going to carry this stuff? And we took the problem to Duncan, and Duncan says, "Well, follow me." He goes out in the back of the Pune Club, heads over to the clothesline and cuts the entire clothesline down of the Pune Club hotel, and cuts it up into pieces and helps everybody, everybody made straps from the clothesline of the Pune Club. Now, I thought that was pretty innovative. Everyone in the mandalay that we met was just absolutely unique. I mean, they were like unique species, each one a gem, and here it was like our generation, the young, Baba had said that to Mani and Mara that he said, you see all he pointed to his finger, his ring finger, and said, all these gems that will be coming. And And that's where it all that's where Darshan in 69 is where it all began, because once people started going to India, it never stopped. You could say it began from the moment Baba dropped the body, because a small group made it there, you know, within the 7-day window when Baba was being interred in the tomb. But so you could say it started right then. And he had said before the Darshan, you know, during this late 68, middle of 68, Baba would say all these cryptic things like, coming, coming, came, I am tired of the illusion game. And he would say, don't, you know, he'd tell the doctors not to worry about his health, because he said, I'll be very strong, I'm going to give the Darshan a reclining position. He said, this Darshan will be unique because it will not end. Did you know that? He said, this Darshan will be unique because it will not, it will go on. Well, that's an interesting thing, because it did go. And in fact, you could say that the Darshan, 69 Darshan, is still going on right now. Every time, because, you know, but at the time Baba said all these things, the Mandalay had no idea what he was talking about, and neither, but one of my greatest memories of Darshan was the half-day trip to Mehrabad and Mirzad. There several things happened that were, I gotta say, Baba's got a sense of humor. And I don't even like to admit the story, but it was a very strange thing that happened. Before we went to Mehrabad and Mirzad on that day trip, we were at Baba's house where he was born, and Jal had, his brother, had baskets of Baba buttons that he had blessed in the tomb, and they were scattered all around the place. And I don't know, I have no idea why. I didn't even think about it. I pocketed a few without paying for them. And I didn't think about it. It was just absolutely spontaneous. I paid for some, but then I pocketed some. Didn't think about it at all. The next day after that happened was the day we went to to Mehrabad and Mirzad. And when it was my turn to get on the bus that I was going to Mehrabad and Mirzad, I get on the bus, there isn't a single seat on the bus, except next to Baba's brother, Jal. It was the only place I could sit. And I suddenly remembered that I had stolen some Baba buttons from him. And it just suddenly hit me right at that moment. And that I have to sit next to him. And I was like, immediately like freaked out by this. I thought, Baba had to have arranged this. Because why is there's not another seat on the bus? And why, everybody should have wanted to sit next to Jal. But nobody did. And I thought, okay, so Baba's arranged this whole thing. So I'm sitting next to Jal, and I am feeling self-conscious as all get out. Because I couldn't get it out of my mind. It was like a record player. I took buttons, you know, and I didn't pay for them, and oh my God, you know. And I don't know how, I was trying to figure out a way to say something, to break, and I just kept running this thing for like 2 hours. I didn't say a word. And finally I realized this had to end. So I said, Jal, you know, I think I forgot to pay for a couple of buttons yesterday. And, you know, and he got all excited, and we became totally the best friends after that. I mean, I used to go and hang out with Jal, so I have lots of Jal stories. But it was and as a matter of fact, over the years, I bought thousands of dollars worth of Baba buttons for Jal. And I would bring them back to the States and make them available for the centers. And Jal would take those buttons to the tomb and get them blessed and then bring them back and then mail them to me in boxes. So I had like major karma with Baba buttons. And I consider that's like Baba's sense of humor, because Jal and I were like connected like at the hip from then on. Then the other thing that happened, there were many things that happened, but when we got to the tomb, most people would just bow down to the tomb, go in for one minute and leave. I walked in to the tomb, and I went up on and just sat around the back of the tomb, and I couldn't leave. I just stayed for the entire time, and I watched everyone coming in and leaving. There was a couple other people did the same thing, and the energy in the tomb was so fantastic. I just was, I can't leave here. And then after we left, so I just stayed in the tomb the whole time we were at Mehrabad. I didn't hardly see anything else. And then we went to Merzad, and I witnessed a very odd, I'll end the story probably on this incident, because it was one of many odd incidents. There was a dog at Merzad in those days. It was a German Shepherd, and it was one of Baba's dogs. I forget its name right now. And he had quite a powerful presence and a powerful personality, this dog. Well, but I didn't pay any attention to the dog, particularly. But we were bowing down at Baba's bed or something like that. So we were right around that entering into Baba's bedroom. And I overheard somebody kind of loudly say, "Oh my God, the next thing you know, we'll be bowing down at the pot Baba pissed in." And I was like pretty shocked by this. And I don't remember where it happened, but I think it was actually not at Baba's room. I think we'd already gone to Baba's room and we were back on the veranda area, and people were going into the blue bus and things like that and bowing down. And I heard this guy say, "The next thing you know, we'll be bowing down at the pot Baba pissed in." Right at that minute, the German Shepherd ran across the gravel dirt and ran up to that guy, lifted its leg and pissed on him. I swear this happened. I watched it. And I thought, oh my God, man, this Baba's got a sense of humor that, and you know, I probably over the years I've seen thousands of strange experiences but that was like too good. It was just too incredible. So that pretty much wraps up the Darshan. After getting back to the United States from India, I could feel that my karma in this life had started to speed up dramatically. I mean, I could feel that things were not going to be as they had been. And in 1966, I had got married to a woman named Sharon and had a child with her named Lisa. And I'd never been, I got taken to jail just after we got married, so and then by the time I got back, before I got out of jail, I found out she was hooked on heroin, and there's nothing I could do to help her. And I was extremely upset about this. I was hoping that, we were going to settle down, and so I called my parents from prison and said, if you don't get her parents and you guys to kidnap her and take her to somewhere where she cannot get drugs, she will die. I said she will die. And somehow I just knew this. And so I was hysterical while I was in prison about because my parents couldn't do it. Her parents wouldn't believe she was hooked on heroin. They were in total denial. Our daughter would never use such a thing. Anyway, 2 days after I got back from Darshan, she committed suicide. So I'd only been 48 hours back from India. I got a call from my mom, and she said Sharon has died, has committed suicide. So I went to her funeral, and Mara had given me a little lock of Baba's hair, and I took one strand and put it in her casket, and I realized Baba had just taken her out of the picture. And I tried to get custody of Lisa, but believe it or not, the parents wanted custody of her, and they basically used my relationship with Mayor Baba so they went in front of a judge in a court and basically made me out into a drug addict and a guy who's into this cult. And Phyllis came as a witness for me, Phyllis Frederick. And in the cross-examination, they asked her, well, who do you take Mayor Baba to be? And that was the end of my case, by the way. She said, God in human form, in front of the judge. And so basically, I lost custody of Lisa, but and so I never really had, it's just like Baba had taken all of that karma out of the more or less just removed all of it from, and so that's kind of how I get back from India, and I'm 2 days back, and that's how things began. Several months went by. It was now October, and a small group of us decided we wanted to go up to Yosemite National Park together. And I went and drive in Jack Small's mother's truck, and I think we went up for it was like around the New Life Day, when Baba started the New Life, October 16th. Anyway, spent a couple of days up there, and two girls went with us. One was named Laurel, the other named Chris. Laurel Folds was from New York. I had met her at the Darshan, and while we were at the Darshan, we had looked at each other and walked over and just hugged each other, and I felt Baba link us up. It was on the steps of Guru Prasad, is actually word. So I felt this Baba link us up, and because of that linkage, she had felt the same thing. She came out from New York City, and she was part of our post-Darshan Baba community experience. Her name was Laurel Folds again, and she was part of the New York group, actually. She had big afro kind of curly hair, very, very sweet, and everyone loved her. Anyway, so October 16th, around there, Virginia Small, her sister, Laurel, Chris, and myself, we went up to Yosemite. And we had a great time. We did a kind of a silence for a day. And on the way back, we were singing Baba songs all the way back. And when we got somewhere near Fresno, California, we filled up Virginia's truck with gas. And she had a very unusual truck. It had, because she used to drive to Mexico with her son Jack Small, and they used to spend weeks and months in Mexico. So they had 2 saddle tanks that you could fill along with the main gas tank. So when you put gas in that thing, you put 40 gallons in, or more, 50 gallons. It was, we were at the gas station filling the gas tank, and Laurel suddenly demanded to drive the vehicle. And I didn't want her to drive, because it was a very large camper truck. It was a truck with a camper on the back. I felt totally against her driving. Virginia kept signaling me, don't let her drive. Laurel insisted on driving. And we were in a stalemate, so we all gave in. We didn't know, we just gave in. So we pull out of the gas station, just filling the tanks. We're probably 10 minutes down the freeway, which in those days wasn't an interstate, it was a Highway 99, two lanes on either side. You could drive about 60, 65 miles an hour max. We're driving down well, it was like a freeway. And suddenly I was reading a little booklet called The Silent Splendor by Yogi Sidnoon Bharata, who was one of the yogis that used to sit at Baba's feet in the 60s at Guru Prasad a lot. You would see him in the orange robes. He had written this book called The Silent Splendor, and I was reading this part of the book where it suddenly said the following: and Mayor Baba had 2 fatal car accidents, one in the east and one in the west. And it used the word fatal car accidents. And I suddenly said to the girls, Laurel was driving, I was sitting shotgun, Chris was in the middle. I said, what is he talking about? You know, Baba didn't die in either accident. And what does he mean by fatal car accident? Anyway, we were just discussing that, and I felt these same kind of feeling you have butterflies when you go on stage. Suddenly I was aware something was going to happen. Laurel changed lanes and the truck went out of control at 65 or so miles an hour, meaning that she just changed lanes, but possibly just too quickly, and the back of the truck fishtailed, and it wouldn't stop fishtailing. It kept fishtailing more and more. The truck flipped over onto the driver's side, and we were, at this point, we were kind of hypnotized by the experience. We weren't thinking, we were just aware. And we were thinking, I mean, if we were thinking, what's going to happen here? And suddenly the girl in the middle yelled, Baba! Baba! Like that. And we had forgotten about Baba. Even though we'd been singing Baba songs for the last couple of hours as we left Yosemite. And but we were so hypnotized by what was happening that, and so as soon as she said Baba, we all started saying Baba. Now Virginia's in the back with her sister. We can't communicate with them because they're in a camper. So it's just the 3 of us in the front of the truck. It was like a Ford truck with very heavy doors. In those days, the doors were all solid steel. And so we were going, Baba, 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 taking Baba's name as fast as we could. And as we did that, I felt more of a sense of calm come over me. But um, suddenly I heard a sound. I didn't know what it was, but I realized that one of the saddle tanks had ruptured and gas was leaking, and we were still sliding along the freeway, and the sparks ignited the gas. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, this is very serious. This is serious. Because we're not even slowed down. I mean, we're still sliding along the freeway. And I thought, and I remember thinking, okay, we're probably going to die. But we were kind of calm because we were saying Baba, Baba, Baba. But the girl, so when we came to a stop, the flames just started pouring in the driver's window where Laurel was. And even though we were all saying Baba, 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 Laurel just melted into the flames right in front of me. I mean, she didn't even, there was no resistance at all. It was the strangest thing. It was very surreal. The girl in the middle was screaming, Baba, don't let me die. Baba, don't let me die. But we were all saying Baba anyway. I was saying Baba. I'm thinking, I'm kind of in a disembodied state. I'm thinking, I'm not going to get out of this. There's no way to get out of this. And I wasn't feeling panic. And then suddenly I heard a voice say, you're not getting off that easy. You're getting out of this. And as soon as that thought came, I got hit by energy on my lower chakra. So much energy hit my lower chakra, that survival thing, that I realized I was going to get out of it somehow. And so I stood up on the steering column of the truck to try to gain leverage because the door was a very heavy door and it was above my head. So the idea of getting that door open was extremely difficult because I didn't have enough leverage to get it open. So the only way I could do it was standing on the steering column and pushing with all my might, and maybe the door will flip open. But the chances were remote because it would tend to slam back down. The first time I did it, the door slammed back down. And while I had it open, it acted as a chimney, and the flames were pouring in through the cab. And so I realized I had no time at all, but I gave it one more shot. This time, I did something where I actually just pushed it all the way. I don't know how I did it. Pushed it. Maybe I had help because it was almost impossible to push it to get the leverage to do that. Somehow I got up on the edge of the door frame on my knees. I looked down and the girls were, I suddenly realized there's no way I'm going to be able to get them out. And at that moment I felt a terrible conflict within myself. Why should I get out? And it was like a momentary conflict, but I stood up. I had bare feet, by the way, for some reason. Stood up on the where the door frame is, and then all I remember from there is just flying through the air because the truck blew up. The main tank went up. I hit the ground like 20 feet away, and it tore half the sole of my foot came off because I hit the asphalt full force. I didn't fall. I landed standing because I had been a surfer, and somehow it was like surfing. I just flew through the air, landed on the ball of this left foot, and the whole sole of my foot was ripped off halfway. And I felt this searing pain. But I was taking in the situation because right there, standing there with a fire extinguisher, was a policeman in the middle of a freeway. turns out he was behind us. For all I know, he might have been the reason that Laurel changed lanes. I don't even know. And behind him was a doctor and a nurse coming back from probably a liaison in the mountains or something. And they wrapped me in blankets and put me on and I was still going Baba, 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 Baba. And I was screaming, you know, get the girls out of, but I knew it was hopeless. I knew they were not going to be saved. And I felt terrible about it. And Laura was like a saint. I mean, everyone that had met her felt like she was an angel, not a saint, an angel. And she did have she had an angelic presence. So I suddenly realized, well, this is serious. What's just happening is serious. Meanwhile, I was laying down for a minute, and all these cars were stopping. There was about 30 or 40 cars that stopped. And the flames were shooting 40 feet in the air. It was just like it was like the fire hydrant I'd seen, except it was flames. And it was like they were blue flames just going like, and it was so hot that it was melting the camper, which had broken loose from the truck. Otherwise, Virginia would have been killed and her sister would have been killed. But because of the stress sliding along the freeway, it had broken loose, but it wasn't far enough away. It was melting the metal. It was still close enough to the truck that the flames were melting the... So all of these motorists were pushing the camper away. So I kind of limped over there to lend a hand, still saying Baba's name, and searing pain in my left foot. But we were all trying to push the camper away because it would have melted. It could have caught the whole thing on fire. And they did get it far enough away. The truck, there was nothing left of can you imagine a truck? There was only 2 railings left at the end. It was like Baba had cremated the truck. It was like it had been cremated. There was nothing left. Like no girl, there was nothing. And anyway, so I was in the hospital for up there for a day or 2, but they didn't have a good. It was more or less like an emergency place, and they didn't have experts there. I had burns on my arms and feet, plus that injury. So I got shipped down to a hospital near where I lived. And while I was in the hospital, people started visiting me. In fact, I had so many visitors that it caused a scene in the hospital. And ironically, I was working in that hospital at that time, and I got fired because I had like hundreds of visitors. And later on I got fired after I got well. They terminated because of all the Baba. It was a Catholic hospital. They didn't like all that Baba energy. And anyway, so while I was in the hospital, I started getting messages. Phyllis Frederick was living in Plainfield, New Jersey when the accident happened. She had been transferred by Mattel Toy Company temporarily from LA to New Jersey. And when the accident happened, she had a vision of Baba, Mayor Baba, appeared in her living room. And she said he looked like a giant bodhisattva. And on his knee was sitting this little girl. It was Laurel. Phyllis knew who it was. Laurel telepathed to Phyllis. She said, "Phyllis, let my parents know that I'm with Baba and I'm happy and I'm okay, not to worry." And so Phyllis somehow knew about the accident before she was even told because of this vision. And Phyllis eventually did talk to to Laurel's parents, who were from New York City. Laurel's father was a stage actor. He was in a couple of Fellini movies, and they were an interesting family. Anyway, I couldn't get out of the hospital to go to this, but one day I heard that they were having a kind of a reception for the two girls at the Baba bookstore in Venice, California. So the parents, Laurel's parents, flew in from New York for this reception. And now I only heard secondhand reports, but everyone that was at the reception, there were 200 people there. They said that it was just a giant celebration. Nobody could wipe a smile off their face. And the parents were trying to be depressed and bummed out, and there was so much happiness. It was like the spirit of happiness was in the room, and nobody could be bummed out. And so the parents got interested in Baba because of this, and then Phyllis told them I don't know if Phyllis was there at this thing because I can't remember. I was sort of like out of it after the accident, but Phyllis did tell them about the vision she had about Laurel, and they went to Myrtle Beach Mayor's Spiritual Center, met Kitty and Elizabeth, and then they came back several times after that. So they were drawn to Baba. There was a couple of things that happened in the accident that are associated with the accident that need to be said, because at the time they didn't mean anything. But one of them was that when I was in the accident, I don't know if I heard a voice, but I definitely got it. The information was given to me that this is the end of the honeymoon, the Meher Baba honeymoon. It's over. We're moving into a different phase now. And that everyone in the Baba family was in that accident, our accident in some way. Meaning that directly or indirectly, this was going to affect everyone. I didn't know what that meant. It was all very strange. Like reading that booklet before the accident and reading that, and then, so somehow, on some weird level, I felt like it was connected to Baba's accident, but I couldn't, to this day, I can't say why, for sure. It just seemed. Then, years later, well, when I went to India in 1970, after the accident, after I healed up, I was on crutches for quite a while. But when I got to India, the Mandali wanted to hear the whole story. And plus, I had to tell the story publicly to the Bombay Center. And I didn't want to do that, but I had no choice. But Jal Dastur set it up. And when I told the Mandali about it, I didn't know this, but Mara must have been affected by the story in some way, because she never told me this but she told my ex-wife Terry Adams. She told Terry to tell me that I should share this story with Baba people, and that I should tell the story over and over. And to this day, I don't know why Mara said that. And I've not really told the story. I've never told it on tape before. I've never told it on, I haven't written it down or published it either. But anyway, for me, for a long time after that accident, I felt like I was like Baba had just stripped layers of sanskar. And I realized that this journey with the Avatar is no game for the faint-hearted or the weak. or the, you know, it was like, oh my God, is this how, I mean, how much, if this is in the first few months after Darshan, my God, I mean, so 1969 was, for me, a banner year.
What about Virginia and her sister?
Virginia broke her hip, she had a concussion, and her sister had a concussion. She was knocked out. And she was not quite the same after that for a while. Virginia healed up pretty good because she went to India and went to Goa and swam every day in the ocean. That really helped her heal up. So Virginia got over it. Belle didn't get over it very well, as I recall. Anyway, it was the beginning of my adventure with the Avatar. You know, so in a way, all these stories kind of go together. They kind of blend into each other because they all happen within about 12 months or less. I don't tell this part of the story. I don't think some people would care to hear this part of the story, but I'm going to share it because it's good to make a record of these things even. Because before Terry and I got married, I didn't know Terry and I were going to get married. But Phyllis must have had a sixth sense about it, Phyllis Frederick. So when Phyllis would see Terry and I together, this is I would say around 1971, 72. I don't really. It was definitely when we go to Baba meetings at her house. And Terry and I were very close friends, and Terry had a twin sister, Lynn, so I liked the twins a lot. But they were both married, and so I wasn't interested in them romantically. But we were really good friends. But Phyllis, at some point, I don't know if she told me this, but she definitely told Terry this. She said, you know, Laurel is hovering between you and Terry. She wants in. Now I heard this from Terry later on, but so then when Terry and I got together and got married in 1974, I believe. So I'm not sure if it was 73 or 74, but anyway, when we got married, I moved to New Mexico, and I was beginning to feel that I mean, Terry was pregnant, and I started to feel like the presence of Laurel frequently at a certain point. And it was just a certain sweetness, a certain very, sweet energy. And so the idea that Laurel was incarnating as my son, what became my son, Erich. I know, and Erich has a hard time dealing with that concept. But on the other hand, I have a very strong feeling Erich was Laurel. Very strong feeling. It's not like I have direct knowledge of it. I don't. But anecdotally, there's so many. The fact that Erich and I work together, we do Baba work together. We've been doing it since he was a kid, practically. I mean, and it just, there's some kind of strange continuity there. In fact, there's sometimes where I literally think Erich is Laurel. I mean, it's just weird. So that's a postscript.